proud DC Bar member benefit, LawPay makes it easy to securely accept payments anytime from anywhere. Their proprietary technology prevents commingling of earned and unearned funds and protects your trust account against any third-party debiting, ensuring compliance with ABA and IOLTA guidelines. Schedule a demo at lawpay.com/DCBar and see why LawPay is trusted by 50,000 law firms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Brief Encounters. I'm Kirk Schroder. I'm an entertainment attorney here in the DC area, and I'm pleased to have as our guest today, John Maher, who is an editor at Publishers Weekly. And today we're going to talk about something that is going to affect the literary publishing world, but probably hasn't had a lot of publicity given all the things going on in the news. And that is the proposed merger of Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster, which will create one of the largest publishing houses in the literary world, and the U.S. Justice Department's efforts to block that merger on the basis of antitrust considerations. So, John, thanks for doing this today. And just as a footnote to our listeners, John is doing this from Amsterdam, and it's early evening on a Friday there, and there's a carnival going on outside. So if we get some carnival voices and sounds, it's all the better for our podcast. But welcome, John, and thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Kirk.
Absolutely. So just some background for our audience. In the publishing world right now, there is a so-called Big Five publishing houses, and Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House are part of that Big Five. The others are Macmillan, Hachette, and Harper's Collins. And together, the Big Five control about 80% of the trade market for books in the U.S. And I don't know the exact number, but I know Penguin Random House has a big share. And basically, if those two got together, we would have a Big Four that would have a dramatic impact on just four companies controlling and dominating the publishing industry. And where this is, I guess, a big example is when you have literary agents shopping deals. All of these big publishing houses have various imprints, and those imprints will not usually compete with each other when bidding for projects as a general proposition with literary agents. So not only could this merger in creating the type of market share that the merger would bring about, but it would also severely impact the ability that already is significantly high of literary agents to get books out in a broader sense, given the amount of control among what would then be the Big Four. Am I getting that right, John, or anything I'm missing there?
You're getting it pretty close. I mean, this is all sort of fairly complicated because everybody has their own numbers. Every company has its own understanding of the numbers. Each book business organization has its own understanding of the numbers. But 80 to 90 is I think, a fairly safe bet. And obviously, in the case, the government and the defense had completely different perspectives on the numbers. But I think that's a fairly safe assessment.
Yeah, so let's talk about the arguments. First off, the literary publishing industry is very subjective, right? I mean, so I'm reminded of the film industry in the old studio days where the studios controlled both production and distribution. And ultimately, in the Paramount antitrust cases, they broke up distribution in order to break up the monopoly. And then, we've had all sorts of interesting things going on in the film industry. And I guess this is sort of similar in that if you have five already right now that control approximately 80% of the market, and it's not easy to get a major market for books, plus you don't have other publishers ever to break in that market, then there kind of is a monopoly there. Would you agree with that, or?
Well, let me sort of lay this out. So one thing that's really important to understand about the publishing industry in the United States as we see it today is that it is a history of consistent and dedicated consolidation, both in the US in particular and outside of the US as well. So if you look at a lot of these companies, let's just look at Random House. Even before Penguin and Random House merged in 2012, Random House was comprised of a number of major former publishers. You're talking about Doubleday, which used to be its own publishing house, Knopf, Alfred A. Knopf, which used to be its own publishing house, Random House, which used to be its own publishing house. There's a slew of others there as well. Vintage, Anchor. A lot of these places used to have their own standalone businesses.
And Penguin was once by itself, was owned by Pearson, I think.
Penguin had gone through its own large amount of like conglomeration and consolidation. You had Penguin and Viking and all these different houses that sort of merged together. And then when you have Penguin and Random House merge in 2012, I think people were actually in the business were quite surprised that the Department of Justice didn't sue to block that merger because it already made a publishing company that was significantly larger than the publishers around it. That case was a little bit more complicated because Pearson, the company that owned Penguin, retained a 25% stake. But a few years later, Pearson sold the entire business to Bertelsmann. That's another thing that's interesting about this whole situation. And I don't know if you want to delve into it here, but brief, 4 of the 5 major book publishers in the United States are foreign owned. They are not owned by American publishers. Bertelsmann owns Penguin Random House. Holtzbrink owns Macmillan. Vivendi is purchasing Lagardère, which owns Hachette Book Group. That's French. We got 2 Germans and a French counting right now. The 4th one, HarperCollins, is owned by Rupert Murdoch. And the 5th one, Simon & Schuster, is owned by, at the moment, Viacom CBS, which has said it is going to sell that company regardless of what happens. So looking at the Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster situation here, whether or not Penguin Random House acquires Simon & Schuster, Simon & Schuster's getting sold. Who it's getting sold to? Well, Vivendi was the underbidder last time. HarperCollins also wants it, but maybe they don't work. Maybe there's another situation. Maybe one of the major Chinese publishing companies tries to come in and get it. Maybe it goes to private equity, which is what's happening to a lot of other companies in this business. So there's all kinds of possibilities here. But I think I'm not quite answering your question. So let's go back to it.
No. I think this is a little complicated, so we need some background. I think really what I want to focus on is what is the impact on the actual publishing industry and for authors and agents out there. As you know, the agents were opposed to this. They were on record saying that this would be a bad thing. And again, it's always been my experience that imprints under one major house don't like to bid against each other. Although I think as I looked at some of the record, the defense here, the 2 publishers said, yeah, no, we do allow them to bid, but they're just more efficient. So I don't know if I agree with that or not. I don't know if you have a thoughts on what that does to bidding on books that major agencies put forth to different imprint.
That's kind of complicated too. So the defense actually had a number of agents as expert witnesses as well. In fact, I believe at least one of them was a paid witness. I think that's how that works though, right? Like expert witnesses are paid.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Okay, great. So that clarifies that. So I think most agents, and this is corroborated by a survey that the Association of American Literary Agents, I believe that's what they're called. They used to be called the Association of American Representatives, and they just rebranded. So I might be getting them wrong. But the AALA did a survey of their membership, and like something like 87 or 90 or 93% of their membership said that they thought this was going to be bad for the business. The agents that were mustered by the defense as expert witnesses were all incredibly powerful agents with extraordinary influence in the business over a very long period of time, who had very remarkable relationships with major publishing figures in all of these companies. So I don't need to read into that, but I do think we can look at that and say, okay, the average literary agent says one thing, these incredibly powerful literary agents say something else. I do think, by and large, agents think this is going to be bad for business. Obviously, the government also thinks that it's going to be bad for business, but the government's case was focused very specifically on one segment of book auctions and sales, which are books sold for $250,000 and higher, which it was trying to argue effectively was a sub-market of the book business. The defense was basically saying it is not a dedicated submarket. You have no justification for that. You're making up a term in order to win this case. It has nothing to do with the reality of the book business. The Christian market is a submarket. The graphic novels market is a dedicated submarket. $250,000 and above is just a price point.
Yeah.
I think there's good arguments on both sides in that scenario. Who made their case better is a different conversation, but I think on both sides there's a legitimate argument there. Publishers that spend a whole lot of money on books tend to treat them differently in terms of marketing. If you spend $700,000 on a car, you're going to take a lot better care of it than you are if you spent $15,000 on a car. You're just gonna. It means, well, probably not, because the kind of people who can spend $700,000 on a car, it's a whole different story. That, I think that comparison to some extent holds water. If you spend a lot of money on something, you're going to want to make sure that you get your money's worth. And so I think that was kind of the government's point. Whereas the defense was sort of saying, oh no, all the books are our babies. We love all of them. We treat them all equally. There's some truth to that too, but I think for the most part, we can all sort of look at that and understand how commerce works. Yeah. These are businesses. These companies are businesses. And the kind of companies that can spend $500,000 on a book are different companies than the, 10-person literary house based in, Memphis, Tennessee, that spends $3,000 on a book and hopes it wins an award in order to make its entire business worthwhile for a year. It's just, you're talking about completely different things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's some interesting points we'll talk about from the government standpoint. I mean, one, you just talked about consolidation, the history of consolidation, which just begs the point that it's unlikely that any other publishing house is ever going to break into this big five or big four, depending on the outcome of this case. And that is a dramatic control of the market. And that just may be the nature of it. I don't know whether there is an argument to say that you're preventing other publishers, and I don't even know who they would be, that could try to enter into this market and open the market, make it more competitive for bids on books coming in. And then, secondly, what does that mean for the ability to get, books into the market and to that level? My guess is that at least my experience is that there's a lot in that 20% or 10% of the book market that's not very valuable from an advanced standpoint or economic standpoint, just because of distribution and the way technology is this day with print on demand and other things, the Kindle revolution, things like that. So it really is becoming more and more of a finite market. Again, the argument I thought was most interesting was whether or not imprints would bid against each other or not. And my experience in dealing with agents, most of them say that they won't bid against each other. And at the very least, there's an efficiency within the house. So if you had interest in a book, you might have two of the four, one of the four interested in a book, and you pretty much have to go with whatever you can get. There's no competition per se. Is that a legitimate viewpoint, or?
It's fairly close. So Penguin Random House, as it stands today, does have a rule that allows its editors to continue to bid against each other so long as there is another bidding editor from another house not owned by Penguin Random House,
Yeah.
right? So let's say an editor from Knopf and an editor from Riverhead both want a book. If there's an editor from Scribner, which is owned by Simon and Schuster, and currently not owned by Penguin Random House, if an editor from Scribner is bidding against an editor from Riverhead and an editor from Knopf, both Penguin Random House companies, those two editors can continue to bid as long as the Scribner editor keeps bidding.
Yeah.
Once the Scribner editor says, I can't afford it, I'm done. At that point, under the rules that exist at Penguin Random House currently, the two Penguin Random House editors that are left cannot bid against each other anymore. So whoever gets the highest bid of the two wins. I don't actually know what happens if they have the same bid, but I would guess that it would go to the house that has the better plan, but I'm not entirely sure about
Yeah,
that.
and obviously that does affect the marketplace. And I imagine the other big four have other rules themselves. So that is one legitimate point. Do you think the publishers, Simon Schuster, do you think they have an argument right now that basically says, hey, this is not going to change the business at all? Do you think there's a legitimacy to their argument, to Penguin, Random House, Simon Schuster?
I don't know if I can directly answer that question, but indirectly, I have sort of a thought on it, which is that I don't think whether or not this merger goes through, consolidation in the book publishing business is going to stop anytime soon. Like, consolidation is kind of the way of the business at this moment. From the people that I've talked to in the business, there are a couple of different perspectives here. So, from an employment standpoint, the terms that I've heard bandied about by a number of sources that I've talked to have sort of told me, we have the feeling that if Penguin Random House buys Simon and Schuster, at least for the first couple of years, about 80% of the people are going to continue to have their jobs. And in court, the testimony by the M&A VP at Penguin Random House, which the judge actually tossed, basically saying was not rooted in any understanding of the numbers outside, like it wasn't independently verified,
Yeah,
and she
there was
didn't
no
consider it
foundation to the
credible.
testimony.
Right, she didn't consider it credible, but he did say that they estimated the loss of about 70 jobs. And I'm not sure that I don't believe that is 20% of Simon and Schuster, but I don't know the numbers exactly off the top of my head. What I have heard is that people were sort of estimating like it's not going to be more than 20% if Penguin Random House buys it. But if a smaller publishing company buys it, even if that's a big five like HarperCollins, there's going to be much more likelihood that they're going to see redundancies in the business, so-called redundancies in the business. And, in order to quote unquote maximize efficiencies, you've got to love this bloodless language on the corporate side of things. There will be more lost jobs with private equity. If that were going to happen, even more so, right? Because they want the backlist. They want the books that have been making money over time consistently. They don't care about acquiring new books. They just want their eyes are watching
The
God or
existing
whatever.
ones with track records. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So that's an immediate impact that might happen no matter who buys it. And in terms of the prices on auctions for books at that price point, at the point that the government was arguing is going to be hurt, I mean, my personal opinion is if there is one utterly dominant company in the business, it is very likely that it will be able to set a monetary standard in a way that other companies can't. It is also very likely that it will be able to pay more than any other company in most circumstances. And as a result, the vast majority of the business is going to slowly move its way over to that one company. Now, I am not an economist. I am not a legal expert. And I am a journalist who's covering this business from the perspective of someone who is fascinated by it, but not necessarily an expert in the business side. But that's my
Yeah,
gut.
it's some common sense obligations when you can have the power to get whatever manuscripts you want, and you have enough of the market share to put whatever you want into the marketplace, then that's pretty obvious. All right, so from an employment standpoint, from a bidding standpoint on manuscripts, which is why the agents as a majority don't like it. How about the price of books? You think this affects the price of books at all?
So I've had a couple of conversations about this with folks too. On one hand, I have heard that the price of books is too high, or is as high as it's going to get for a consumer to buy it. And most publishers don't believe that there's any chance of them pushing it any higher, even if there's a major publishing house owning. So if we're talking about consumer labels, right? $25 for a hardcover. A lot of the folks that I've talked to have told me, I don't think they can really push it any higher. That said, I have talked to booksellers, some independent booksellers, who have told me, and now the booksellers that I've talked to in this circumstance are in major US cities. In fact, one of them was in Washington, D.C., and another one was in New York City. And those booksellers are dealing with a completely different market than one in even Boise, Idaho, let alone a little town somewhere in Idaho. But they've told me, book prices raised $5, $10, we might be able to sell them anyway.
Yeah.
So whether or not those kind of conversations are happening in a way that is making, CEOs' eyebrows raise, I'm not sure. I think the general wisdom at the moment is that the prices won't raise, but there's also a movement in the business right now to stop printing the flat price of books on the back of books because booksellers in certain areas would like to lower those prices
Yeah,
or
and have
raise them
flexibility.
depending on right, because it costs a hell of a lot more to own a bookstore in New York than it does to own a bookstore in a small town in Iowa.
Yeah, and, if there is good news, 5 years ago when the negotiator be part of a book deal, we were always told that in today's age, 80 or 90% of all the books would be electronic. And so we always started worrying about that ebook royalty rate and anything going on there. And of course, that, got established pretty early out. And people, I mean, obviously, people talk about hardcover and trade back royalties. But interestingly, that's not the case. I mean, still, the printed book is still the standard in today's technology. And if anything, post-pandemic, if we are in post-pandemic, is continued to thrive. So that is one positive thing about all this, whether this affects that market or not. Any thoughts about that or?
It's really interesting because one of the conversations that was being had at the trial, I mean, specifically, I remember Marcus Dola, the CEO of Penguin Random House, mentioning that he thinks that the biggest threat to the publishing industry is not consolidation. It's not, these issues. And obviously, he has a reason to say that. But what he said it was I forget how he put it. I forget what he called the model. But basically, he was talking about he thought that the big danger was that there was going to be a Spotify for books or a Netflix for books that that you would end up with a subscription model for ebook rental that would effectively entirely kill publishers' abilities to make money and therefore pay to make more art. There are a lot of things to unpack there, and we can't do that in the half hour we have. But I do think his worry at this point seems like it's not going to manifest. There have certainly been a number of attempts to make the equivalent of these things. At the same time, I do understand the sort of existential terror, that a lot of these publishers feel around copyright and around subscription models. I get it because they look at the music industry and they look at the movie industry. A friend of mine, a critic who was also covering the trial, sent me a video of that show Hot Ones where
Yeah.
the celebrities eat wings. There was a video of Matt Damon doing Hot Ones, and he was asked a question about why Hollywood couldn't make the cool indie movies that they used to be able to make, why they're all these big nonsense blockbusters now. And Matt Damon was basically like, look, you have to understand, like, if you spend $25 million on a movie in the 90s to make some artsy movie, you have to end up making $100 million in order to make that movie profitable, because you've got to pay the theaters and you've got to pay the marketing people, and all of a sudden the bill is much higher. We don't sell DVDs anymore. We can't make money on like an indie hit that gets like a bunch of press after it's gone to DVD. That used to be able to happen in this business. We can't do it anymore. If it doesn't make it in the box office, that's it. So all that stuff is way riskier now. And I think there's an application, if you look at that, of how that happened to the movie market, I think publishers are scared of that.
Yeah. It's so far, though, unfounded, at least, but it was legitimate fear
Yes.
4 or 5 years ago. So, what do you think the bottom line is here? What are your final closing thoughts on one? What do you think the court's going to do? I likely will be appealed one way or the other. And is this much to do about nothing, or is this something that's we'll see the long term effect on it one way or the other?
It'll be appealed one way or the other. Interestingly enough, isn't the judge going to that court of appeals? Like, isn't she on her way to just that court?
Mhm.
So that's a fun little side note. I was not at the trial for the last week and a half. I've been on vacation, hence the carnival music behind me in
Uh-huh.
Amsterdam. But what I saw was a judge leaning slowly in the direction of the government. And I think if you look at the fact that she tossed the defense's M&A VP testimony, like tossed a testimony, but kept a similar testimony from the government's, I think there's something right there, right off the bat, that you can just say, that seems like she's leaning in one direction. I also saw some of the way she questioned some of the CEOs, and in some cases, some testy exchanges with lawyers on the defense's side. To my mind, it seemed like she was leaning toward the government. Then again, I have a friend who's a lawyer who basically told me, like, whatever it seems like the judge is leaning in the direction of, they're leaning in the other direction. Never trust a judge. I don't know. It's not my expertise.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's a good, a solid answer. All right, John. One last takeaway that you think our audience could benefit from that we haven't talked about. Obviously complicated, but what do you think the biggest takeaway from this right now?
Well, what I'm really, really curious about, I've heard through the grapevine that there's some grumbles on multiple sides in the book business that, like, this case isn't really about the book business, that this case is about the government being able to establish a monopsony, to establish a way to break up antitrust based on monopsonies and not monopolies, attempting to get past the Robert Bork era of antitrust legislation. And there's certain grumbling in the book business that's like, oh, Penguin Random House, Simon and Schuster is a sacrificial lamb, and this isn't really about us. It's about Amazon and yada yada yada. I'm not sure that's entirely fair. I do think this company would be very, very large. I am really curious to see whether or not the way the government framed this particular case will allow them to effectively set a standard, or if because they chose this sub-market that they arguably kind of invented in order to make their own case. Whether or not it's going to crumble in the face of other attempts to block monopsonies, I don't know. But I am very curious to see whether or not the government wins the case. Whoever appeals, I'm very curious to see how the appeals court handles that specific issue.
So we'll know more when the appeals happen. So, all right, well, we're just about at our time. John Maher, editor at Publishers Weekly, has been our guest here talking about the complicated Simon and Schuster Penguin Remnant House proposed merger in the Justice Department, trying to prevent that. This is Kirk Schroder. I'm an entertainment attorney in the DC area, and you've been listening to Brief Encounters, sponsored by the DC Bar. Continue to listen to us, and John, thanks for joining us. I know you're in Amsterdam, so I hope you enjoy the carnival.
Thanks, Kirk. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
This episode of Brief Encounters was brought to you in part by our sponsor, LawPay. Schedule a demo at lawpay.com/DCBar to see why LawPay is trusted by 50,000 law firms.